Now, in terms of the actual political response, there has been a major war now breaking out within the GOP about how the response should be. Nikki Haley obviously taking up the neocon mantle and basically calling for war with Iran as a result of this and a complete flattening of Gaza. Here's what she had to say.
But let's step back because I want the American people to kind of take this in for a second. Just imagine that here the Israelis woke up and communities were bombarded, families were murdered, women and children were taken hostage, dragged through the streets, the elderly were taken. All of this has happened in front of everyone, on top of thousands of rockets that hit Israel. This should be personal for every woman and man in America. Why? Because when they did this surprise attack, when they took these hostages, when they murdered these families, they were celebrating. And what were they celebrating? They were saying death to Israel, death to America. This is not just an attack on Israel. This is an attack on America because they hate us just as much. America can never be so arrogant to think we don't need friends, just like we needed them on 9/11. That's why Ukraine needs us when Russia's doing this. That's why Israel needs us when Hamas and Iran are doing this. And I'll say this to Prime Minister Netanyahu, finish them. Finish them. Hamas did this. You know Iran's behind it. Finish them. They should have hell to pay for what they've just done.
Calling for war with Hamas, calling for war with Iran, saying that this is an attack on America. Former Vice President Mike Pence taking a shot at his old running mate, Donald Trump, as well as Vivek Ramaswamy and Ron DeSantis also in reaction. Let's take a listen.
Well, I am, but let me begin at where we ought to start. I mean, that disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan has emboldened the enemies of freedom around the world. And now war is raging in Eastern Europe. And President Joe Biden's kowtowing for the last 2.5 years to the mullahs in Iran, lifting sanctions, begging them to get back in the Iran nuclear deal, and then paying $6 billion in a ransom for hostages, I think set the conditions for this unprecedented terrorist attack by Hamas against Israel. But I also believe this is what happens when we have leading voices like Donald Trump, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Ron DeSantis signaling retreat from America's role as leader of the free world. What happened in Ukraine was an unprovoked invasion by Russia. What happened this weekend was an unprovoked invasion by Hamas into Israel. And I really believe now more than ever, both the debate within the Republican Party and the debate within America is whether or not we're going to once again stand without apology as the leader of the free world, as the arsenal of democracy.
This is it's 2005. If I listen to these people,
seriously, how many wars did these people want to get in?
Yeah, I know.
Should we just add China to the list while we're at it, just for fun? I mean, a lot of people, folks at Raytheon, very happy right now.
I am in the Bridge Colby camp. I am personally doubtful we could win a single war, let alone like 5 wars, as a result of the current state of the U.S. military. One of the reasons I'm so against aid to Ukraine. And to them, there's the limitless number and the checkbook for what can happen, and also that there's no idea that you have to prioritize certain things that actually advocate and work for your national interest. And Nikki Haley, this is an attack on America, begging Prime Minister Netanyahu to strike Iran. I mean, Iran is not some piddly little country. This is a massive country, huge population, huge army. I'm not saying that they're, I'm not saying they're like a great power, but it's not a joke. And there's a reason why we have not undertaken strikes on Iran. And there's a reason why U.S. military planners consider it a nightmare scenario, because it has a neighbor with Iraq. They have a proven military capability with the IRGC and others. And it would just cause even more chaos and destabilization in the region. Same with Mike Pence. As you're saying, he's like, to them, everything stems back to Ukraine and then to Afghanistan. How about this? The world is messy and not everything is interconnected. I hear this from the Ukraine first people all the time too. They're like, well, we got to support Ukraine because that means we got to support Taiwan. I'm like, well, hold on a second. They're actually completely disparate situations with different actors and different histories. Same thing here. It's like if this had happened in 2005, they would have been like, oh, this is a result of 9/11. They always have to try and tie it to something else that's bigger and going on to try and justify even more military conflict and others. And it's like, okay, well, what has that policy gotten us? It ain't winning, and it certainly ain't. It certainly is not, peace or prosperity for them or for us as a result of this. So, look, I'm happy that these voices are not prevailing right now in the Republican Party, at least right now, with the actual voters. But this is the actual think in Washington.
Well, and let's be clear. Like, there isn't actually any dissent on Israel within the Republican Party.
Sure, absolutely.
Like, Trump was incredibly hawkish, did everything that, Israel wanted him to do, incredibly hawkish towards Iran, took us out of the Iran nuclear deal, assassinated Qasem Soleimani, all of these things, right? So it's not like they're trying to paint this picture like there's some dissent here when there really isn't. The only person who was a little bit different on Israel, who quickly backtracked and tried to pretend like he wasn't actually different on Israel, was Vivek Ramaswamy, who made some comments about how he would like in the fullness of time to not be supporting them militarily. Here he is with Sean Hannity getting questioned on those comments after Nikki Haley specifically attacked him over it. Let's take a listen.
You said aid to Israel, our #1 ally, only democracy in the region, should end in 2028, and that they should be integrated with their neighbors. I have an exact quote. You want me to read it?
That's actually, I can tell you the exact quote. What I said is it would be a mark of success if we ever got to a point in our relationship with Israel, if Israel never needed the United States' aid. And Sean, you know how politics is played. A lot of the other professional politicians who have been threatened by my rise have used that statement to say that I would cut off aid to Israel. That's not correct.
So in any case, he's backtracking, and it just shows you how sensitive this issue is, how influential, people for whom this is their #1 issue are within the Republican Party, also within the Democratic Party. You've only very recently had a few voices in the Democratic Party that are even a little bit dissident on this issue and also want to talk about Palestinian lives as well and the, unconscionable blockade and occupation apartheid conditions that have been imposed on these people for years and years now. But within the Republican Party, there's basically only one position that you can take on this issue, and it's being extraordinarily hawkish.
Well, a lot of it actually, it's interesting. You could think about it a little bit like the pro-life issue. Some of the most vehement and extreme supporters of Israel are evangelical Christians. I'm not a biblical scholar, so I cannot even attempt to explain it, but it just has something to do with the end of days and why the state of Israel needs to exist and Christian tie-ins. There's also been actually a very heavy attempt in Israel by the Israeli government to cultivate a lot of these people. They help fund a lot of trips back and forth. Yeah, if you're ever on a flight to Israel, it's funny. Half the people on the plane will be evangelical Christians. The other half will be Jews. And a lot of them are coming to visit some of the holy sites, and a lot of it is funded by both churches, nonprofits, and these other organizations which have now existed for a long time. They put an immense amount of pressure on GOP lawmakers. You also, I think, have the old 9/11 tie-in. It's very much a lot of people like to have black and white thinking. It takes a long time to actually separate that, to think about it. Most people haven't been over there, or they just look at the news and are like, well, one is allied with our enemies and one always has our back. So they're like, okay, this is a simple equation. So that's how a lot of American voters are going to think about it. I mean, I think there's a reason that all opposition to Israel is predominantly in the U.S. an elite left project. And it's because it comes from the university and academia class, because they have more of an interest. Obviously, they have probably more sympathies to the ideas around human rights and all of that, but they have more of a awareness generally of what's going on. So I think that's why it's difficult.
There's a huge age divide here.
That's true. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Huge age divide. And the politics on this, I mean, that might be, if you look at the numbers, one of the biggest generational gaps on the Democratic Party is between older folks and younger folks in terms of the prism with which they view this conflict. And we were talking, in some ways, it feels so depressing, the cycle of violence, just knowledge that there's not going to be a simple, easy, straightforward solution. There just can't be at this point after all of these decades of absolute horror. But you do see, even in the media coverage, you see, different perspectives you never would have seen before, even like the New York Times and CNN, with voices you never would have heard before, actually talking to Palestinians in addition to the Israelis who, are suffering and grieving right now. So you do see partly this is a result directly of Netanyahu becoming very partisan during the Obama era.
Yes.
And really throwing in with Republicans and actively trying to thwart Obama's reelection. And that has created a very different political dynamic within the Democratic Party than used to exist. And I'm talking not at the elite level, where there's still mostly unanimity, like I said, with a few. You've got Rashida Tlaib, who is actually Palestinian American, who is being blocked, by the way, from visiting her grandma in Palestine by the Israeli government. So you have a few different voices on the Democratic side, but there's also been an overwhelming campaign to try to defeat in primaries anyone who would have a different view on how to approach this conflict whatsoever.
That's a good point. I remember saying it at the time. I've said it many times here on the show. It's probably the single biggest mistake Bibi ever made in terms of U.S. political support. He aligned himself with an opposition party against the sitting president of the U.S., which allowed the Obama administration to say, look at this man coming to my soil to speak out against my policy in my Congress. Having that dramatically opened the Overton window, because when you were allowed to criticize Bibi, then you were allowed to criticize Israeli policy.
Yeah.
That led to there was some moment at the end of the Obama administration where they even allowed some UN Security Council resolutions to pass that they never would have allowed to happen in the past. Even the Biden administration, they've mostly been 100% pro-Israel. The Israelis wouldn't say so, but not a huge departure from previous policy. But even they've had a few.
There's some friction between, personal friction between Netanyahu and Biden, but it hasn't really amounted to different policy. I pulled up the numbers just to give people a sense of how this is becoming, there's starting to be a more partisan valence to this. In 2023, Gallup asked, in the Middle East situation, are your sympathies more with the Israelis or more with the Palestinians? Obviously, this is before the current situation and atrocities that were just committed. For Democrats, for the first time ever, more people said their sympathies were with Palestinians than Israelis. 49% of Democrats said Palestinians, 38% said Israelis, and 13% said neither or no opinion. Independents, they also increased their level of support with Palestinians, but they still overall have more sympathy towards Israelis. It's 49% sympathy towards Israelis, 32% Palestinians, 19% neither, both, or no opinion. With Republicans, very different landscape. 78% say their sympathies lie predominantly with Israelis. Only 11% say they're more sympathetic towards Palestinians. So, that is a very new phenomenon. If you look back at like 2010, you had 60% of Democrats saying their sympathies were more with Israelis. So in only 13% saying that their sympathies were more with Palestinians. So there's been a really dramatic shift in terms of the level of I guess, support for Palestinian statehood and the complexity with which the situation is viewed within the Democratic Party. And I do think a lot of that goes back to Netanyahu making it very partisan. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.